It's noon, so we can go ahead and get started. My name is David Bennett. I'm the curator of maritime history here with the North Carolina Maritime Museum. And thank you to everyone who's shown up in person and also the people who've tuned in online to listen to this program. So what I'm going to be talking about today um, is North Carolina's role in supplying the American Revolution by sea. And so I know like probably a lot of y'all have heard about like blockade running during the Civil War. Well, there's kind of the same thing was going on during the American Revolution as well. And that's pretty much what this talk is about. It's not so much about combat as it is about getting supplies into the state and then moving them on to like the Continental Army and to the militias that are fighting the British elsewhere. So we've been first talking about sort of the British blockade and occupation of the American coastline during this period. So the Royal Navy had a huge problem on its plate with the American War of Independence. The bulk of the Royal Navy is in European waters. It's in British waters because they have to make sure that the French and the Spanish don't try and intervene in the conflict. They have to worry about the French potentially invading, which the French and the Spanish did try to invade England later on in 1779. But so the majority of Britain's capital warships are still in European waters. The ones that are the British Navy that's in American waters is having to primarily support British Army operations. That's their main mission in the U.S. They also have to protect British naval bases. So the big ones in American waters are New York City, St. Augustine, Florida, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Those are the main ones. There's a few others that kind of come and go throughout the conflict. There's also have to protect the British merchant marine also, because you've got merchant vessels that are going to Canada. They're also going to the West Indies to conduct trade with British colonies there. And so you have American privateers that the British merchant marine has to worry about. There's other imperial possessions. Like I mentioned, you've got Canada, you've got the West Indies. There's raids that the Americans are making down the West Indies, like Bahamas. Also, they have to worry about like the French and the Spanish potentially getting involved and trying to grab those imperial possessions. You've got also just a limited number of vessels to also just try and blockade American ports. You've got 1,000 miles of coastline, and considering all these other factors, that only frees up about I think it was like at maybe like 50 warships to try and cover 1,000 miles, 50 or less. So blockading the American coastline with all these other factors is just a nearly impossible job. You've got Boston, which is occupied by the British in 75 and 76, major deep water harbor. You've got Newport, Rhode Island is occupied by the British from 76 to 79. New York City is pretty much occupied by the British for the entire conflict, another major deep water port that the Americans don't have access to. Then the British were also blockading the Delaware Capes and the Virginia Capes as well, so blockading access to the Chesapeake Bay and to the Delaware River. Of course, the Delaware River goes to Philadelphia, and the Chesapeake Bay, you've got sort of Norfolk, Baltimore, ports like that as well that are being basically cut off periodically. You also, at certain times, the British Navy is also in those waterways too, various times throughout the conflict. Philadelphia is occupied from the summer of 77 to about the beginning of the summer of 78 by the British. You've got Charleston is occupied from 1780 to 1782. Another, this was sort of the main entrepot of the South was Charleston. if it wasn't being, some of these big ports, if they're not being blocked, if they're not being occupied, the British are keeping a close eye on them and trying to blockade them. Because naturally, like the British think, well, this is where all the main trade's coming through, so these are the ports we really need to focus on, are ones like these. North Carolina is sort of an interesting situation because you've got the Battle of you've got the fall of Fort Johnston, and then you got the 75, and then you got the Battle of Moore Creek Bridge in February of 1776. After that, there are no major military operations going on in North Carolina until the fall of 1780. You have skirmishes that are going on with loyalists that are happening within the state's interior, and you've got some raids happening along the coast, but no major military operations. So this North Carolina is like the perfect place as a logistics hub to funnel supplies through. Also, it's incredibly difficult to blockade the North Carolina coast because you've got all these, huge shoals coming off the three capes. You've got unpredictable weather. You've got super shallow inlets that are difficult to get in and out of. It's the graveyard of the Atlantic for a reason. It's also really far from the British resupply bases. And the British weren't really able to effectively resupply at sea. And so, these vessels would be off the North Carolina coast, but if they had to resupply, they'd have to go all the way down to St. Augustine, and there wasn't necessarily another vessel to take its place in the blockade. And so the blockade of North Carolina is very intermittent throughout the war. A really good example of just how difficult these inlets are is Ocracoke Inlet. So in March of 1776, there's a French blockade runner that goes through Ocracoke Inlet. The British see this and they try and go after this French blockade runner through Ocracoke Inlet, and they run aground in the inlet, and the crew is forced to scuttle the vessel, and then they have to march up the Outer Banks all the way to Norfolk on foot. The crew of this British vessel that runs aground trying to go through the inlet. So it's really dangerous and difficult. So let's talk about North Carolina's port towns, the ones we have to kind of consider. So Brunswick. So Brunswick town, it's in Lower Cape Fear. It's North Carolina's premier deep water port. It's on the Cape Fear River. Of course, it doesn't exist today. I mean, you've got an archaeological site there, but the town itself doesn't exist because a British raid in 1776 burns the town. After that, the residents abandon the community. And when the British come back in 1781, they burn the community again. So it's pretty much useless as a deep water port for North Carolina from basically the early years of the Revolution. Then you have Wilmington. Wilmington, there's some shoal grounds between Brunswick and Wilmington that are in the way, but it's still, it takes on a significant amount of marine traffic. This is sort of the main hub of North Carolina's naval stores, so tar, pitch, turpentine. Most of that which is being exported from the state is going through Wilmington and Brunswick. The problem with this is that the Cape Fear is blockaded by the British Navy in 1776. I don't think they left till like the fall of 76. And then due to the deep waters of the Cape Fear, it's pretty vulnerable to raids and attack. And throughout certain periods throughout the Revolution, the Continental Congress is actually telling the people in Wilmington, don't stockpile too many military supplies or naval stores in your community because it is so vulnerable to attack. A really good example is you have a British raid in May of 1777. You had HMS Merlin and Bruin went into the Cape Fear River and burnt several anchored vessels. So it's pretty much defenseless. There wasn't enough fortifications and artillery in that area to ward off the British Navy. Another big problem with um, the Wilmingtons or Brunswick area is most of the supplies, particularly in the first half of the American Revolution, is going north um, up through Virginia, Maryland, and then up into the northern states from North Carolina. So basically, to communicate with Virginia, because again, Chesapeake Bay is blockaded, you'd have to go up the North Carolina coast and then through Ocracoke Inlet and then up through the Sounds and up the rivers into Virginia that way. The main problem is off the North Carolina coast, you're subject to the Royal Navy, but probably more hazardous are British privateers that are lurking off the coast. So that's a problem. You've got Beaufort, which I characterize more as an auxiliary port. Um, Beaufort doesn't have any major deep rivers that go deep into the interior to move supplies. It is more of like a safe haven, and actually is more of a privateering base, um, more than anything during the war. Um, so you've got a safe deep water port, but no like deep water for rivers for internal communication. However, you can lighter supplies when you're in a pinch. They could lighter supplies through the Sounds. Uh, so like Middle Back Sound, Core Sound. So during the Revolutionary War, all the vessels of heavy burthens, as well as all others which fell to the southward of Cape Lookout, ran into Beaufort rather than run the risk of being taken while lightering at Ocracoke or weathering Cape Lookout, and from Beaufort sent their cargoes and lighters to such ports on the waters discharging at Ocracoke as they saw proper. So in other words, they're moving supplies. They might be landing supplies at Beaufort, putting them on smaller vessels and moving them to places like Newbern and Edenton, and then upwards through Virginia is what's going on there. A really good example of that is in 1780, you had a brig from Virginia picked up goods at St. Croix, landed them here in Beaufort, and then they put that cargo on smaller vessels and then forward them up to Virginia, to South Key, Virginia, which I'll get to South Key a little bit more. You've got Cape Lookout, which it's not a port, but you have a deep water anchorage there. The geography of Cape Lookout was much different than it is today. The bight was much deeper. You could have um, uh, uh, um, vessels of deep burthen um, go in there and shelter. You had a French frigate in 78 showed up to Beaufort and couldn't make it into the harbor. So they went back out to Cape Lookout to use the anchorage. And while they're there, they set up artillery on the shore. And that was sort of the origin story of Fort Hancock. And then these French Army and naval officers then partnered up with the state of North Carolina to actually build a permanent fortification there at Cape Lookout to protect merchant vessels that were coming in. And there is some documentation where merchant vessels were unloading cargo at Cape Lookout and then lightering that cargo through the Sounds and up to Virginia. So you have Ocracoke Inlet, which is the main pathway, the main gateway into North Carolina's key ports for the Revolution, which are going to be Newbern and Edenton. It's deep enough kind of to get vessels through there, but once you hit the swash, which is the sort of shoal area, it's only about 9 feet at high tide. So some of your biggest vessels just can't really get past the swash. So only really sloops, schooners, some brigs and snows can make it through, but most British warships are not going to be able to make it in. And it could even take 8 to 12 days just to get through the inlet and the swash, just based on like the wind and weather. You had a lieutenant of the Royal Navy wrote to Vice Admiral Samuel Graves in 75 that there's no port on the continent so famous for smuggling. He's talking about Ocracoke. You had the former royal governor, Josiah Martin, complain to Lord George Germain, who is the secretary of the colonies. In 78, he called Ocracoke the contemptible port of Ocracoke because so many supplies were coming through that inlet to supply the Continental Army. You had loyalist John Cruden wrote in January '78, there is an amazing quantity of goods brought into North Carolina, and that Virginia and Maryland are supplied from that quarter. And so you had this one British privateer in April of '78 reported that there was 50 vessels inside Ocracoke Inlet. So just large numbers of vessels daily passing through that inlet. In North Carolina, like communities like New Bern and Edenton are basically saved by North Carolina's geography. It was certain that no hostile vessels of any size could venture over the bar and the swash. Thus, most of the American trading ships took refuge here, where they could take in or put off cargoes and security. Philadelphia merchants established themselves here. The Virginians brought hither their tobacco by land carriage, taking in exchange West Indian and other wares, which at that time were over plentiful here. So lots of trade happening in North Carolina. New Bern becomes one of the main ports. It's just right across Pamlico Sound from Ocracoke Inlet. You have a large French presence during the American Revolution in New Bern. You have French merchants setting up, and they're trading military goods, clothing, blankets, salt, shoes, everything that you'd need to supply an army is being traded in New Bern. New Bern also sets up fortifications to protect the approaches to their waterfront. And there's also an armored vessel in the harbor that's acting as a floating battery to protect it as well. Bath is sort of a minor port. It's of minor importance. Early on in the American Revolution, there is gunpowder and weapons being brought through Ocracoke into Bath. But it's too isolated to be of much importance. And once you kind of get through the Pamlico River to the Tar River, the Tar has a lot of problems with navigation due to the shoaling. And the communities along the Tar just weren't as developed at the time. So really, Edenton becomes possibly the most prosperous and the most important port in North Carolina because of its location on the Chowan River. And the Chowan River becomes the main highway from North Carolina into Virginia. So you've got all these supplies, they're coming through Ocracoke Inlet, they're coming through the Sounds, they're getting to Edenton, and then from Edenton, they're going up the Chowan and Blackwater rivers into Virginia. And they're going to this small community called South Key, which was basically this little plantation that just sort of blossomed into this maritime community. So you've got, and it's kind of hard to see on this little map, but down here you have the Albemarle Sound and you have Edenton, and you've got the Chowan River, and then you get up to the Blackwater River up here. And up in this area, you're really close to the James River. Williamsburg's over here. Suffolk is over in that area as well. And so basically, you're getting in the water on the Blackwater River is deep enough for sloops, schooners, even some brigs to get up in there. Ocean-going vessels are getting all the way up in there. And it's been a corridor of maritime trade between North Carolina and Virginia since at least the 1750s, maybe earlier. It was definitely used as sort of a corridor for communications and defense between the two colonies in the early 1700s. But they had a shipyard, they got wharves, warehouses, even a customs house. In this teeny little community that all just kind of picks up because of the Revolution. And it's far enough inland to really be protected from British raids. But you've got all these ads sort of in the Virginia Gazette talking about vessels. Like you've got the schooner that's at South Key that come from the West Indies. You've got another schooner, Good Friend, that come up from the West Indies with cargo. You have here a sloop, Johannes and Alida, also. Oh, this one's from Bordeaux, France. And then you have the ship Royal Exchange, talking about taking on, tobacco, and telling people to send the tobacco to South Key or Edenton. You got two schooners at South Key from Cadiz, Spain. So you got this tiny little inland maritime community in kind of not far over the border of North Carolina and Virginia that is basically an international port and an arms depot for the Continental Army. And this corridor is and Ocracoke is so important to both Virginia and North Carolina that the two states get together and they agree to finance, construct, and operate two large armed galleys, the Caswell and the Washington, to station them at Ocracoke Inlet to deter British privateers from getting in and conducting raids. So let's talk about more like this wartime trade. So sort of the big products that are coming out of North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, that are being traded through North Carolina's tobacco and naval stores. And it's really mostly tobacco because the French really love tobacco, and that's the main commodity that they really want, and they're offering a lot of money for it. And in return, we're getting military supplies, so gunpowder, cannons, muskets, but also we're getting uniforms, blankets, shoes, salt. Salt's incredibly important because you're using it to preserve meat. You're also using it to keep horses and cattle healthy, using it to tan leather. There's so many important reasons that we need salt, and we couldn't produce enough of it domestically to meet our needs and demands. Here's an example of some trade between Santo Domingo and Edenton, June 1778. Sorry, it's not really showing up very well on this TV. It's showing up on the computer, all right. But 117 tons of pig lead, 100 hogsheads of rum, and brass field cannons are brought up from Santo Domingo, which is pictured here, to Edenton. There's also, apart from military supplies, you've got luxury goods are coming in as well. So this ad right here is talking about luxury goods from France. They've got all kinds of fine cloth of scarlet, white, blue, brown, drab cloth. There's all sorts of goods, pencils, gold epaulets, pen knives, razors, scissors, all kinds of things are being brought in apart from military goods. Pardon? Oh, that's a measure. It's like a really large barrel. So you got this one merchant. So I had that one quote where they talked about northern merchants setting up shop in North Carolina. So an example of that is you have Hugh Williamson, who he's a medical doctor and a merchant who's moved to Edenton. And the reason that he moved to Edenton is because during the war, he and his brother get into this sort of wartime trade with the West Indies. But most of their trade is originally being conducted through Baltimore. And in the summer of 1777, there's a huge British flotilla that goes into the Chesapeake Bay to capture Philadelphia. And so he's really worried about Baltimore falling. So he and his brother move their operations to Edenton, and here, like, their business really takes off. They start off with one vessel, and they quickly start building a small fleet of merchant vessels to conduct internal trade, but also trade in the West Indies. And he wrote, Hugh Williamson wrote to one of his merchant friends, a very profitable trade may be carried on without adventuring at sea. Foreign vessels, either French or Bermudians, frequently arrive with valuable cargoes. They must load with tobacco or with corn, pork, etc. They want dispatch, so they want to move with speed. There's another quote that I saw from a letter in the John Adams papers where people were calling Edenton the Mart of America because there's that many French vessels that were constantly coming in through that port. And so you also, all this trade is fueling boat building operations. So you've got this one vessel that's advertised having been bought here, built here in Beaufort, of 55 feet on the keel. And then more on Philadelphia merchants. We've got William Morrison Company. This is kind of interesting. They chartered a sloop. They wanted to charter a sloop or schooner at Martinique down in the West Indies, and then send that vessel to Edenton with products like salt and molasses, which they were then consigned to the local merchant of Smith and Hughes out of Edenton, and then they were going to return to the West Indies with tobacco and use the tobacco to buy medicine and munitions for the Continental Army. So that was one way of how they were conducting their trade. You also had Baltimore merchants that were operating out of Edenton. You had John Smith and Sons, Lux and Bowley. They're importing gunpowder and cloth from the Dutch island of St. Eustace. And then they're selling those goods to North Carolina and Virginia committees of safety, who are then equipping the militias. So we actually have some smuggling instructions from Joseph Hughes in Edenton. In 1775, he wrote to this captain to go sail out to Spain, pick up wine, and then go to the salt islands in the Caribbean and exchange the wine for salt and gunpowder. And then he said, then return to North Carolina by Ocracoke Inlet. If you can't get in through Ocracoke Inlet, he said, go in through New Inlet. And he said, if you can't go in through New Inlet, he said, land the stuff on the beach on the Outer Banks, and then move it across the banks to a smaller vessel, and then move the stuff onto Edenton from there. So that's kind of how the smuggling operations are going on. You also have signals for getting into Ocracoke Inlet. So here's some instructions. When off the bar of Ocracoke, you are to hoist a jack or ensign on the under part of your jib boom as a signal for a pilot, and hoist your ensign union down. So basically telling people the secret code basically for letting the pilots at Ocracoke know that you're a friendly vessel. You had Joseph Hughes, I mentioned earlier, of Hughes and Smith. He's actually one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He's a representative in Congress. He's also an extremely successful and wealthy merchant. He had contracts also with the Continental Congress. He's on the Continental Congress, and he had contracts with the Continental Congress to supply the Continental Army. Maybe a little bit of conflict of interest, but people did things differently back in the day. But so he had a brigantine, Fanny, carried tobacco to Europe and conduct trade on behalf of the secret committee to bring arms and ammunition back. And he was getting paid 400 Spanish dollars per month for this trade. Instructions were to the Fanny to return to North Carolina or to another safe port here on the continent. So you also have covert aid coming from the Europeans. France is really famous for doing this. So prior to France coming in and developing a treaty of alliance with the Americans in '78, they're trying to secretly conduct this trade by setting up front companies. Kind of like how the CIA has done, like to conduct covert operations, have plausible deniability in foreign countries. The French government was doing that during the American Revolution, at least in the first half. So a really famous company is Rodrigue Cortales and Company, Spanish-sounding name, with a Frenchman behind it. His name is Pierre Augustin Beaumarchais. He's a really interesting guy, royal watchmaker, famous playwright. He wrote The Marriage of Figaro and The Barber of Seville. He's a diplomat. He's a spy. and he becomes an international arms dealer during the American Revolution. He's a big advocate of the American cause. He makes his front company in partnership with Louis XVI of France, and basically he's funneling money and weapons on behalf of the French government to the Americans. And a lot of it is going through the West Indies, and some of it's coming directly to America as well. So you also have Spanish covert aid as well. France and Spain, the House of Bourbon, they hate the English, and they're trying to get back at them for their failure of the 7 Years' War. And so you've got supplies coming from the ports of Cadiz, Bilbao. You've got Spanish Caribbean, Hispaniola. They're all funneling supplies into the colonies. And some of it's coming into North Carolina, like this one example of brigantine Success. Then you also have Dutch covert aid as well. Early on, the Dutch are sending supplies from the Netherlands into France, and then they're being reshipped from France to the Caribbean. And the Dutch have these neutral ports in the Caribbean, so, most famously St. Eustatius, where a lot of this supplies are being funneled through. Later on in the war, they get bolder and they start using Amsterdam to run supplies to the Americans as well. And again, some of the stuff is coming through North Carolina. You've got the Danes are also involved in supplying covert aid through the West Indies. They got St. Thomas, St. John, St. Croix, and American vessels are constantly going to those islands. One example, in October 1776, you got 6 North Carolina vessels going through St. Croix in 16 days. And one example, you've got this one vessel going from Curacoke, a Danish vessel, crewed by Englishmen. You got British sailors on a Danish vessel that get caught running salt to North Carolina. The Swedes are also involved in providing covert aid as well. And we have the Diana is captured en route to North Carolina. You've got illegal trade going on with Bermuda. So Bermuda is still a British colony. It is part of the British Empire. It is not officially in rebellion. However, they're conducting trade with the American colonies that are in revolt. It's because Bermuda is it's a small island, and they've depended on the colonies for food. And with the war going on, that's cut off, and they can't make enough food domestically to supply their population. And so they just resort to breaking the law and conducting trade with North Carolina. And so North Carolina is getting salt in exchange for pork, corn, and peas and other produce. There's a really interesting story in February 1778. You've got a British privateer, Bridger Goodrich, captures 2 Bermudan vessels that are conducting trade, the sort of trade with North Carolina. And he brings them into port in Bermuda as prizes, and they're going to be condemned in the Vice Admiralty Court. And once he gets in the port, he's greeted by a mob of 400 Bermudan men who threaten to murder him if he doesn't let these vessels go. And he says no, and he gets these British Marines to take up station on his vessels to protect him. The next day, the mob comes back. They're armed this time, and they've got small boats to go effect a boarding. And they also seize the fortifications surrounding the port to make sure that he can't escape. And so the only way this rebellion is kind of put down is where Goodrich says, okay, I promise to let these vessels go, and I promise not to seize any more Bermudan vessels. So North Carolina was regulating this trade that it had with the outside world. Originally, you started off with the committees of safety, so were in a lot of communities, like you had Wilmington, Newbern, Edenton. They all had committees of safety, and they were regulating the sort of maritime trade, largely to prevent people from trading with the British, but also to kind of regulate, communications and commerce with outside nations. Then you had the North Carolina Council of Safety, which basically took over this job of regulation and kind of narrowed things down to Newbern, Bath, and Edenton as being the main ports where they're going to have purchasing agents. And then the General Assembly later on starts appointing purchasing agents and individuals to regulate this trade. And then when the General Assembly went to recess, then the governor took over that responsibility. So here's an example of some overseas trade that's being regulated. So you've got all these wood products that are going to be sent down to the Caribbean. And this captain, David Barron, is being told, you can conduct this export trade, but your net profits have to go towards getting military supplies for North Carolina. And not only that, you're going to have to pay 3,000 pounds as sort of a bond, or kind of like a deposit, a performance bond. Because if he didn't do this, then he would lose that money, which has a lot of money. And so that's how they ensured compliance. In 1779, or really, well, actually in 1777, North Carolina sent some purchasing agents off to Bermuda and to the Caribbean to try and negotiate purchases. It didn't work out too well because they said, you can only make these purchases with credit. And basically North Carolina's credit was worthless. But in 79, they appoint Benjamin Hawkins. And this time when they sent him down into the Caribbean, he was backed with tobacco. And so his job was to arrange for the exportation of tobacco from North Carolina to the Caribbean, and then to import weapons back into North Carolina. His first deal went down in May of 79, where he was able to procure 10,000 muskets and bayonets from France. Later on in September of 79, he exchanged 1,000 barrels of pork for salt. November 79, he needed to get 200,000 pounds of tobacco to the Dutch island of St. Eustatius. However, he could only get enough boats to move 80,000 pounds. So North Carolina had plenty of tobacco to trade, but they just shipping was just a huge problem. February 1780, he's able to procure military supplies, but not enough vessels going back to North Carolina. And then shipping rates were really high, which is another challenge he had to deal with. February 1780, there's so much tobacco in the French and Dutch Caribbean that the value, the price of tobacco just plummets and it becomes almost worthless. So in order to get military supplies, they have to re-export that tobacco to Europe where they can get better prices. Just showing the sort of intricacy of this trade that's going on. So with this trade, there's lots of controversies that take place. The number one fear within North Carolina is this fear of war profiteers, speculators. So Governor Caswell in February 1778 is dealing with basically these sort of military contractors who are coming down from Pennsylvania into North Carolina and buying all the supplies they can get their hands on with cash, and they're paying way more than market value, which is causing prices to shoot up through the roof. And so he has dealt with this before. In 1777, he had failed to counter these sort of speculators, and they had driven the price of salt through the roof in North Carolina in 1777. And so he's like, I'm not going to fall for this again. And he has the justices of the peace in Craven County go after these speculators and seize their goods on behalf of the state. Now they're compensated at market value, but they're not getting paid more than market value for their goods. But that's one of the ways that North Carolina dealt with this sort of thing. There's also with all these merchants, there's a lot of jealousy, there's mistrust, there's politicking that's going on. A good example is Hughes. He gets caught up in one of these controversies. You had Colonel William Aylett, who's in charge of doing procurement in the southern colonies, or one of the main individuals tasked with procurement in the southern colonies. And he went to Congress and accused Hughes and Smith of corruption, of selling salt that was intended for the Continental Army. And the problem, so there was an investigation, and they found what the problem was, that there's a lag in communications. So, by the time, he had gotten the letter to say, hey, hold on to that salt for the Continental Army, he had already sold it. And so, there's confusion due to delays in communication and distance during this period. There's also people kind of get caught up with controversies regarding failure. So Richard Ellis is one of these individuals. So he's down in the West Indies conducting trade, and there's this stockpile of weapons that need to go back to North Carolina. And he volunteers to say, hey, I'll take it back to North Carolina for the war effort. And he's told, well, we need to get, a letter of approval from North Carolina saying that you can take it back. And so while they're waiting for letters to be exchanged between, the Caribbean and North Carolina, his crew is getting restless, and he's worried about a mutiny on his hands. And he's like, sorry, I can't hang around any longer waiting for the mail. And so he goes back home to North Carolina. When he gets back, they're like, well, we sent a letter saying you could bring back all these military supplies, and he came back empty-handed. And so they put him through the ringer. And again, it's just one of these problems with just delays in communication. Another problem is that because basically working on these merchant vessels is so highly profitable, or just being sort of like a military contractor is so highly profitable, that people are they're not renewing their contracts with the Continental Army, or they're resigning from the Continental Army and Navy to go serve in the merchant marine, or as merchants bringing supplies in. And you've got Brigadier General Thomas Nelson is complaining to General Washington, saying public virtue and patriotism is rolled down to South Key, and they're shipped off in tobacco hogsheads, never more, in my opinion, to return. So he was saying that people are putting profits before patriotism, basically. In Carteret County, you also have a recruitment problem. They're November 1780. They're wanting to recruit more troops out of Carteret County. Everyone has basically gone off to work at sea. Nearly all the young and able-bodied men belonging to the said county have gone to sea, and the remainder being either aged or infirm, when absence from their families would be their total ruin. And Carteret County is not the only community that had this problem, or had similar petitions going to the General Assembly. There's communities all across coastal North Carolina are basically saying the same thing. And because you have all these ads, they're popping up in newspapers saying, able seamen wanted for a new ship lying at Edenton, North Carolina, extraordinary wages, top dollar for labor. Then there's all these, like, lots of young men who are going to sea under apprenticeships. You've got this one, Robert Gurley, is being apprenticed as a navigator. You got William Lowe, who's apprenticed to Thomas Pugh to become a mariner in Bertie County. You've got Benjamin Scholzer, apprenticed to Robert Hardy, Trowon County, to become a seaman. So you've got all these young people that are also taking to the waves as well. Now, I just kind of want to highlight a really kind of interesting story that I found during my research. And it's this North Carolina link to Valley Forge. So I'm sure a lot of you out there in the audience have heard all about sort of Valley Forge and it being a cold winter and there not being enough food and clothing and supplies to go around for the Continental Army, and it being a real problem. Um, and kind of Washington said, in December of 1777, we can basically disband the army to make sure that, people are able to live through the winter. Um, and he kind of said that to sort of stir Congress as well as the governors of various states to come to his assistance. Yet General William Buchanan came up with a plan that he submitted to Congress on January 15th, 78. Or actually, he devised a plan on the 15th, submitted it on the 19th, and they immediately voted to approve it. It was basically send supplies from North Carolina by land and water, equivalent in weight to 500 barrels of salted pork. So roughly, not exactly, but roughly 110,000 pounds of supplies per week. So the route that he plotted was basically go from North Carolina's Sounds to Edenton, up the Trowon Blackwater rivers to South Key, then from South Key to Suffolk, and then across the James River, across the York River to the Rappahannock, then to the Potomac, then to Bladensburg, Maryland, then to Elk Ridge Landing, and then across the northern portion of Chesapeake Bay, and then up the Elk River to the head of Elk in northern Maryland, which is really close to Valley Forge. And the rest of the way is overland. And this is kind of roughly what that route would have looked like. All said, it's only about 75 miles on land. Most of it's by water. And then this is the small sort of maritime community on the Elk River in northern Maryland, head of Elk. And it's actually it's a deep water, kind of small port up on a high bluff. The British actually used it as their main landing point in summer of '77 to take Philadelphia. And then it's abandoned by the British, and then the Continental Army winds up using it. It becomes a key logistics crossroad, sort of, for the Continental Army throughout the war. Richard Caswell, the governor of North Carolina, is basically in charge of provisioning the Continental Army, or basically coordinating the sort of supply line. Because the General Assembly was in recess and wasn't set to reconvene until April. And so he gets these letters from Congress and General Washington, begging for his help. And he's basically told, we'll reimburse you some of the costs. But he's like basically having to import a lot of materials. And the only things that you can get domestically is beef and pork. So Newbern and Edenton become really important. And those French merchants that are already there and they're bringing stuff in daily, through Ocracoke Inlet, he's buying up all those supplies. And then if there's any kind of like war profiteers in the area, he's seizing their supplies as well and sending it up. And he also places an embargo on salted pork and beef. So you cannot export it from the state of North Carolina unless it's going to Valley Forge. There's one exception, and that's Bermuda. They're allowed to export to Bermuda in exchange for salt because you can't barrel more pork and beef without salt. And they don't have enough salt on hand to do it. So they're allowing this trade with Bermuda. And it's not until April of 1778 that the British finally decide to do something about this. It's on April 11th that Vice Admiral Admiral Lord Howe gives the order to obstruct rebel commerce at Ocracoke. And this basically order is only standing for like a month or two. They're not able to maintain the blockade off Ocracoke. And later on in 1779, the Parliament holds an investigation. And one of the things that kind of comes out is this whole link to North Carolina. They're like, Albemarle Sound not being blocked up. North Carolina was supplied with salt, and the country abounds in hogs. The rebel commissaries laid up magazines of salt provisions at Suffolk. From Suffolk, they were carried through the mouth of Nesmond and up the Chesapeake to the head of Elk, and from thence in wagons to Valley Forge. Supplies just saved Washington's army from famine. So we got all this stuff that's going on in North Carolina, and people in North Carolina are talking about this. Even the British wound up talking about this. They had good enough intelligence to know what was able. They just weren't able to counter it. And so what happens in the winter of '78, while the Continental Army is suffering at Valley Forge, you've got the American envoys in Paris are negotiating a treaty of alliance with France. And by the spring of '78, news of that alliance reaches the United States. I think in May of '78 is when it is read in New Bern, and there's huge celebrations. And that basically changes the strategic calculus for the British, because now the British Navy or the French Navy can now intervene, and they do immediately. There's a French squadron that's sent from the port of Toulon, which is in the French Mediterranean, and it goes over to New York, and it goes up and down the coast and into the Caribbean, causes all sorts of mischief for the British. And then '79, you've got the Spanish come in. In 1780, you've got the Dutch come in, and it blossoms this basically this insurgency that turns into a war, that turns into a world war. It's not just being fought now in the American colonies, it's being fought in the Caribbean, it's being fought in Central America and Africa. You've got combat going on in India, European waters, Mediterranean, just the whole world just kind of blows up into this huge global war. And then while all this is, and so the British, and from '78 onwards, they're more on the defensive. Now you do have, and then at the same time, they shift their strategic focus in the colonies from the north to the south. And so they go after basically, Georgia and South Carolina. And then in fall of 1780, Cornwallis starts to head into North Carolina. Wilmington is captured and held from January to November of 1781. You got the race to the Dan, which is a bunch of small battles and skirmishes, including like Battle of Cowan's Ford. And you got the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March, the biggest battle in North Carolina. And during this time, the British start to target New Bern. They burn the 1781. The waterfront in New Bern's burned. The waterfront in Eatonton gets burned because they're trying to stop up this trade of supply that's happening. The British also try to go after South Key. They burn part of it, but not the whole thing. And because there's all this warfare that's going on now in the South, the supply line that's going through North Carolina up into the northern colonies gets reversed. And basically, you got the northern colonies running supplies in through to South Key, then down the Blackwater, Chowan River, into the Albemarle Sound. And then they're going on the Marin River to Murphy's Landing, which is today Murfreesboro. And they're running that overland to Halifax. And then there's another route where they're taking it all the way down the Chowan into the Albemarle Sound, and then up the Roanoke River. And Halifax is right on the Roanoke, and there's also a major highway that's going through Halifax. So they're able to then put all that stuff on wagons and send it down into South Carolina or elsewhere into North Carolina where there's trouble. There's also internal navigation that's happening on the rivers to meet these supply needs. So September of 1780, they're transporting military supplies on the Neuse River, and they couldn't hire, boatmen on contract. They didn't have enough money, so they started taking wounded soldiers and having them operate these watercraft on the Neuse River, running supplies from New Bern to the interior of North Carolina. And then there's also, after the British leave Wilmington in November 1781, immediately they start using the Cape Fear River to move supplies up to Cross Creek, which is modern day Fayetteville, basically. And they're using contracted boatmen to move provisions, salt, weapons, etc. And they're paying the boatmen in rum, so they'll work a little harder. And then so basically, the war eventually comes to an end. Peace there's a peace settlement in 1783. And I just want the whole point of this sort of lecture is to kind of point out that North Carolina did we even though there's not a whole lot of major combat operations in North Carolina, and a lot of times when the history books are talking about North Carolina's participation in the American War of Independence, they're talking about sort of North Carolina troops in the northern colonies or down in South Carolina, and some in North Carolina with Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Ray Sedan, that kind of thing. But the maritime picture, there's so many things going on. And remember, this is only one story. This is only about merchant vessels. I haven't even talked about North Carolina privateers and letter of marque vessels, or the North Carolina State Navy. There's so many other things that I'll be talking about in the future, but this is just one piece of the picture. Now, due to all this wartime trade that was going on, there was a huge bubble that formed in North Carolina's merchant economy, particularly in places like New Bern and Edenton. And guess what happened when the war was over and all these vessels from France and the Caribbean aren't coming in quite so frequently? That bubble pops and there's a market crash that happens. And there's this great quote from this German diarist who's visiting Edenton, and he writes, "Edenton found itself in such good circumstance that the inhabitants wished peace away, which made their town be again deserted. Many large and small craft were there, which at the outbreak of the war had run in here and were now half gone to pieces." So basically, Edenton during the war was this incredibly wealthy entrepot, and as soon as the war is over, it becomes a graveyard of ships, and just the trade dries up, and people are saying, "Oh man, can't we have another war?" So, and that's basically the story that I have for y'all, and I hope you all enjoyed it. So, is there any questions out there? I know it's a lot of information. Right here?
Mm-hmm. And
Chat?
okay, I don't see any.
All right. Well,
Let me take over.
I guess if there's no questions, thank you all so much for showing up.
Hope you can join us again. I believe on March 12th, we have a presentation about the shipwreck Carib Sea. It'll be a Thursday as well, and that'll be given